Welcome, friend. In today's Lokayat conversation, we have an eminent guest today, Dr. Michael Taylor. He is the director of the Secretariat of the International Land Coalition, which is based in Rome and hosted by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, a UN agency. And International Land Coalition is itself a very unique experiment. In a sense, it's a forum, it's a front, it's a joining together of multilateral bodies and civil society organizations, social movements who are working on the land rights and resource rights. So welcome, Mike, in this conversation. I will begin with the International Land Coalition, your work in Rome, and one of the members of the International Land Coalition is the World Food Program. I'm not sure whether it is right now or not, but it was in the beginning, and it has been awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a very, very important thing in my opinion, because in the post-COVID scenario, when the situation is so bad, and as we all know that there is a curtailment of budgets by the government, and perhaps we all were thinking in a very different way. How do you think this award to WFP will bring the issue of the resource right, land rights, and hunger at the forefront of the international agenda?
Yeah, maybe a good question. The World Food Program was one of the founder members of ILC. And actually, about 3 years ago, we had a meeting with them and decided to end their membership just because we didn't see their role in dealing with emergencies as really at the center of our long-term program in ILC of dealing with land rights. So, as you know from your work in India, land rights is securing land rights is not an emergency issue. It's not an issue you deal with in an emergency time frame. It's an issue you deal with a very long-term perspective. And so for that reason, WFP is no longer in ILC membership, but of course we link with them closely. We're both based here in Rome. I think what we were most happy about, or speaking for myself, what I was most happy about in hearing about the award of the Nobel Prize for WFP was firstly the recognition of the importance of multilateralism. We work on an issue that is common, that finds a different expression in every country. I think for me, one of the key strengths of ILC as it's grown over the years, as it's grown to embrace organizations all over the world, in the north and the south, in countries like Scotland. Scotland has one of the most unequal land distributions in the world. And so when we talk about land rights and redistribution of land, we're not just thinking of countries in the south. We're thinking of righting wrongs that have been made historically all over the world. And so I think the first idea from the Nobel Prize that we're recognizing the role of a multilateral institution that brings together governments with a common concern. That's been a super statement. I'm not sure, to be honest, the extent to which it'll give a perspective on land rights per se, but I think it gives a perspective to some of the reasons why we work on land rights. So all our members work on land rights, but very few of them would say the end that we want to achieve, the impact, is land rights. Land rights is a means to achieve something bigger. That something bigger can be ending poverty. That something bigger can be gender justice. It can be environmental management. It can be dealing with climate change. It can be more inclusive food systems. It can be building democracy at the local level. And so obviously World Food Program is an important, their work they do on ending hunger is an important reason that many of our members work on land rights. So it gives us an opening in our coalition to talk about why land rights are important, even if it doesn't put the spotlight directly on land rights.
Yeah, because you talked about democracy, land right for democracy, land for even peace building. I would say, because a large part of even in India, where there is a so-called insurgency happening in the name of resource and land. The crisis is basically of the not speaking to the people, and the developmental model which has been imposed from the above without speaking to the people. So one of the issues that ILC has been is dear to ILC, and it has come in focus again and again, was the issue of family farming. And why I am bringing this issue immediately after this is because most of the people, most of the communities which engage in family farming are the indigenous people, particularly indigenous people and Dalits in India, a very small land holding. And my own experience of working in the land rights is basically most of the hunger deaths in India happened to the communities and people which had been absolutely landless. So that is where I want to bring that if we speak to eradicate hunger, the issue of land becomes very, very important.
Absolutely, it does. Absolutely, it does. And I think we're at a moment in history when we can even be more ambitious. We can talk not only of eradicating hunger, but we can talk about the role of small farmers, in the positive role of small farmers in providing good quality, healthy, nutritious food with short value chains for people. And I think that's one of the opportunities that we have out of the COVID crisis, in that we see the problems with the kind of food systems that we've been building over the last decades very clearly. The cracks in the system are very apparent, and so it's we have the chance now to show really the contribution that that small-scale producers, farmers, indigenous peoples, fisher folk, pastoralists can provide. The Food System Summit, which will be this time next year, is a big event on the multilateral calendar, and so we're working very hard in our network to see how we can promote this as a platform for the voices of small farmers, including on land rights.
Yeah, I remember that in 1995 or 97, Rome had hosted a World Food Summit. And now that time the world leaders assembled there, and they promised that by 2015 there will be no hunger, or maybe it will be 50%. But after the COVID and after the it is when we see the policies that the government are formulating these days, mostly they are avoiding the term that's right, but we are using the right-based terminology. Rights have been converted into entitlements, most of the places. Yeah. And that is a challenge. Where you saying that we are calling the World Food Summit or a food next year. How will this summit or your conference ask the government or involve the governments world over to engage with the small farmers, or to actually what is happening in our part of the world is that new sense of narrative is being developed, and that narrative is that small is not good, it is not useful, it doesn't bring it's not very profitable. So even farmers are asked to basically leave their land and give it to the big companies and big corporations. How are we going to fight the narratives that are being built? A counter narrative is being built that the small farming is not profitable, not useful. So no point of doing that.
Yeah. Your question, Bibi, is how do we challenge power, very, very entrenched power, isn't it? In a way which is effective and brings about change. So let's look back to the last Food Summit, 2008 in Rome. And a lot of decisions, a lot of declarations were made, and what changed? Very little. The same narratives that you're describing continued. And you see similar processes outside of what we're talking about here. Think back to the financial crisis at the same time, 2008. And at that time, people saying our financial architecture is wrong. We need to build back something different, something more equal, more resilient. And what happened? They built back exactly the same thing. And I think now, 10, 12 years later, the world can see how badly it responded to the previous big crisis that we went through, and perhaps that was a lost opportunity to fix the system.
Yes.
And so, that gives me a little bit of hope that maybe this time around, it won't just be another talk shop, that we have the opportunity to grab the imagination of the public and of forward-looking policymakers and say, guys, really, the system is broken. We can't just fix it by doing the same thing better. We need to really radically overcome it. And when we overcome the problems that we've created, and I think with food systems, at least in ILC, there's a clear message there. And many small farmers organizations outside of ILC as well, that small farmers are not just people of the past, but they're people of the future. That small farmers give us the solutions to climate-friendly, healthy, resilient, inclusive ways of feeding the world. And maybe this time around, there'll be more people ready to listen to that message. We hope.
I think I agree with your point, because most of the people I've been speaking right now, actually, they feel that, ultimately we have to, this whole COVID crisis is man-made. They say that it's not really, they feel that it's the punishment of, destroying the nature, and it's the time that we get back to nature. Perhaps all these things that we are talking about, in fact, in villages now, in India also, people are, if we see this whole period of last 6-7 months, most of the people are returning to the roots. Even buying the market, going to the market, they are buying the local stuff and all those kind of things which they never had done in the past. So that's the one thing that we are learning, that people are going back to the roots and encouraged to buy the local products.
Absolutely. And so, it's you give a very local example, and I think there are global examples as well. There are the seeds of changed practices which are being sown from the local all the way up to the global. And this is the opportunity that we have. Members of ILC that work very locally, those that work nationally, regionally, and globally, to use this opportunity where there's probably more openness to change than there's been for a long time. And see whether we can really shift food systems in this case, but underneath for us as ILC are systems of land governance, of finally recognizing the right to land for the women, the men, the communities that live on that land. One figure that we've put out as part of our Land Rights Now campaign is data from the Rights and Resources Institute initiative that shows that roughly half of the surface of the world is claimed by local communities through custom or tradition. So this is land that people consider their own because their mother, their grandmother, or their father, grandfather lived on and used, and their people have had it. But actually only 10% is legally recognized by the laws of their country as belonging. So, in the past, that might not have been a problem because people didn't need to legally defend their land because there was nobody else coming to try and take it over. But now, with the hunger for land that we see, and often a cross-border hunger for land, that is an issue. And so that gap of 40% of the land surface, which is considered owned but not legally defendable as the rightful land of local communities, is really vulnerable. And that's, I think, the challenge that we have right now of accelerating the recognition of community land rights, and particularly indigenous peoples, before it's lost. Because once it's lost, reversing that is a much harder challenge.
Absolutely, actually, because what is happening is that in the modern constitutional terms, the state is the eminent domain. And in the past, the Adivasis, the Dalits, many nomadic communities were, cultivating forest land and a lot of their land, which nobody went. But as you say that hunger for market, hunger for resources, particularly the corporations and even the local corporation, not necessarily the international, but also the domestic. And what is happening is that all that which is not legally in the name of someone becomes the state domain. And that has rendered millions of people actually virtually landless or on the verge of being landless. How do we fight with this? Because when the state become the eminent domain and states institutions are unable to help you, so where should people go? Is there any international mechanism, or should we not explore that also?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what we're dealing with is more than half a century after the end of colonialism, we're dealing with a colonial legacy,
Yeah.
aren't we? You know, it was this colonial idea, particularly in British countries that Britain colonized,
Yeah.
that everything that didn't belong to individuals belonged to the crown. And then after independence, the crown became the state, but essentially the same idea perpetuated, just with a different owner and with eminent domain. So it really means shaking off a colonial mindset. And we see that colonial mindset persist in independent countries, particularly against indigenous populations.
Yes.
You know, and your country's an example in India, my country's an example in Botswana, which has quite a small indigenous population. It's about 5% of the country, but 5% of the population, but large proportions of the land of the country were their land. You know, and there's a colonial mindset that the best thing that can be done from these people is remove them from the bush and put them in towns and take away their land, and that land can be used for the national benefit through mining and tourism. And it's a story we just see repeated over and over again in so many countries. And so I think the first thing that we need to be pushing for is a different mindset, a respect that indigenous people's ways of living on and using the land, again, are a vision for the future, not just a vision for the past, you know, and that's changing. You know, many people are starting to, particularly with the climate crisis, realizing, oh, okay, maybe the really civilized people are the people who learned properly to live with nature rather than destroy it. So it's you know, I see firstly, it's really a question of changing mindsets. And so we can bring international legal mechanisms in, like UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then recently last year the Declaration on Peasants, the Peasants Declaration, which I think did, you know, expanded what the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples did, and tried to bring about the same recognition for small farmers around the world. So these international agreements are a good step, but without a change in mindsets, they'll remain quite empty, won't they?
Yeah, I think most of these declarations are very good. I can say that, you know, whether VGGT or all these guidelines, UN Declaration of Indigenous People, but all these are voluntary. And when these are voluntary, then it becomes extremely difficult, you know, to get them implemented. You know, they become just a part of official propaganda that we are following it, but it doesn't get, you know, implemented. So should we move now to this direction that, you know, all these international guidelines are not just merely guidelines, but should be implemented. Like the instrument should be, like, you know, made compulsory on the states. Like when we sign any convention on ILO. I know that India has not signed a convention ILO 169, they say, on indigenous people. There is a pressure on that, but they know it well that, you know, if they sign it, they have to, they become accountable of reporting to ILO. So shouldn't we, like, also doing that we should make all these guidelines into convention, and you know, so that the state are duty bound to report to them every year.
It's a possibility. You know, we work in the land sector, don't we? And often land is really considered a sovereign issue. So it's very difficult to have a binding treaty on recognizing land rights. But it's not impossible. And I think what we see with the VGGTs, which now are 7 years, 8 years old, is they introduce they'd give us a big step in recognizing good practice across countries. So it's one step, and possibly a next step can be beyond saying we agree this is the best thing to do, to saying we commit ourselves to do it and we will be held accountable. Maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. Sometimes even non-binding treaties actually can be more powerful than binding ones, because it's all a question of the legitimacy around them. And if they have strong legitimacy, then they can be very powerful tools. So there's the legitimacy building project that we have around things like the VGGTs, and you can see that 8 years ago, you were part of, as many ILC members were, part of the process of coming up with the VGGTs in the Committee for World Food Security at FAO and giving inputs. And, at that time, there was no global agreement really that talked about land rights. And we had the Millennium Development Goals that completely ignored land rights. And then now, after the VGGTs, we get the SDGs with targets on land rights.
Yes, absolutely.
So what it's done is sort of brought land into these bigger global agreements, hasn't it?
Yeah, because I agree with that point, because once the UN rapporteur on right to food, he was visiting India, and there was a conference, and I was also invited to have a meeting with him. It was in Chennai, and I was a part of India's Right to Food campaign. It started in 2000, and it came out of a hunger deaths in India, and we were reporting. And my position and differences with the campaign was that the campaign worked on the entitlement issues mostly. It was basically trying to get things done through legal recourse, in the filing the cases in the Supreme Court and doing things. But it never bothered much about that the issue is right to access to land resources. So when I met this rapporteur was also like, he came to meet the campaign people, and then he discussed with me, and I said that this is the basic problem of the campaign, and he was very shocked that right to access to natural resources is not part of the campaign. But now they are realizing it, and many people in this campaign on right to food, they feel that right to access to natural resources, right to land, is basically should be a part of this. Otherwise, there is no right to food.
Yeah, exactly. But let me ask you the same question, Vivi, because you're asking whether at the global level, if we make treaties compulsory, and I'm saying I'm not sure. But I would imagine when you work at national level, there's big advantage in getting legal protection, particularly when you go through different governments. Okay, so right now you have a government in India which is not giving a lot of civic space. To what extent would you say the legal protections that you won in India before the Modi government have been successful in protecting some rights, even with a government that may not be very friendly towards those rights?
Actually, in 2004, when there was a government which was led by Dr. Manmohan Singh came, and after that was a good period for civil society organization. They campaigned. Particularly 3-4 things came out of that campaign. The laws that converted, actually, one was right to the Forest Right Act. It was a long campaign that we all had been part of it, People's Campaign, and then the Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Scheme, this Manrega, what is called MNREGA. That was also a part of the campaign of the right to food thing. And the third important document came was right to information. And I can tell you this right to information was one of the biggest achievements, because we could file cases, we could write to any officer and get the information about the implementation and what is being done. But what has happened? And then also about the Land Acquisition Act and the Rehabilitation Act. It came in that period only, and it was really a good act, because so far whenever there was a land acquisition or land grabbing by the government, the district collector will write a letter, and it was 1894 Act, which would say that, in the national interest, we are, acquiring your land. And if you try to hinder, create obstacle, then you will be, arrested. So that kind of a letter would come. But now this has changed, and there is a lot of debate. We always ask people, what is this national interest? And is this national interest always with the indigenous people? You know, whether the national interest will always serve through dislocating or evicting the indigenous people. So what has happened is that after the 2014, and 2014, this government, the changes, it was basically a big, I would say, corporate takeover. Frankly speaking, the government has a full support of the corporate, and the corporate were not really convinced with the previous government's land policies. That land policies made a lot of impact. That changed the whole thing, because the corporate have the all power. We have media 24 into 7, sending fake news. So the most important part of that was the consent part. And I'm telling you this fact here, that from 2014 till this date, all the laws where there is a consent part, like consultation with people, consultation with civil society, publishing notices in local languages, all have been done away with. And the latest is the environmental impact assessment, which is required for all the projects which come, which any industry want to, establish. And this EIA is basically, you have to publish the consultation and publish the whole detail in the local language. So the government this year, they have a draft statement, a draft, they are changing this. And the draft was that, it is not necessary to get this draft published in the local language. So there is a challenge, because if you don't publish in local language, how the local people will respond? So one of the biggest thing was that the democratic governments are not democratic, and they are finding democracy highly, creating obstacle for their developmental agenda. So my point to you is, after this, that ILC is in a unique position, and many times you have civil society, you have we have social movements, and we have the intergovernmental organizations there. So there is a clash many times where the social movements feel that these intergovernmental organizations have power to actually squeeze the states, and they can ask the states. So what happens is that they feel that, at your forum, they can say that, we appreciate what is being done, we appreciate the EPIC norms, but when they sit with the corporate, they encourage them, and without their encouragement, no corporate and no government can go, because ultimately World Bank, IMF, all these institutions, European Union matters a lot. So how to influence our own members, particularly who sits with the ILC, that they should actually push this agenda, like pro-people agenda, so that civil society, social movement are not criminalized, as happening in not merely in India, but many other parts of the world. We've seen Indonesia, we've seen other parts. How does ILC look at this?
Yeah, this is a question that really gets to the root of ILC, and I would say, when you introduced ILC at the beginning, you said a very diverse coalition, and our diversity is our biggest strength, and it's also our biggest weakness. And so the challenge is, how do we really build on that strength? IFAD, World Bank, FAO, UNEP, UNCCD, we'll say we're members of ILC, but we report to our government. They belong to governments. They don't belong to civil society. So maybe there's no formal accountability to civil society, but they are realizing more and more the power of civil society. That 40% of ILC members are constituency-based organizations. So they're organizations that belong to farmers, to women, to indigenous peoples, and together represent about 70 million land users. So there's a very powerful voice of people themselves that intergovernmental organizations are realizing they ignore at their peril. And that can be, in global discourse and debates, say, for example, about the role of corporate agriculture versus small-scale agriculture. or very much so in countries, in particular countries. And we've had a few countries recently where there's been either conflict or partnership between, in particular, World Bank and IOC members in those countries. You remember when we were in Bandung in 2018, and there were demonstrations
Yes.
outside the Global Land Fund against the World Bank. And Indonesia was an example where the dialogue between the World Bank and particularly farmers' organizations in Indonesia broke down, and there wasn't an ability to find some common ground. And that some countries will be like that. Other countries, let's take Burkina Faso as an example, where member organizations also had big issues with the new World Bank project that they considered was being designed, like Indonesia, which undermined their efforts and their vision of the direction that development should take, particularly regarding land in their country. And that ended up becoming quite a big headache for the World Bank in Burkina Faso. And the result of that was taking a few steps backwards and sitting down and having a dialogue with those organizations and saying, okay, let's see if we can understand each other better. Senegal is a country where they're maybe one step ahead even more, and they're actually looking together at how they can be partners in developing a new World Bank project. So I think our role in ILC is how can we find those common grounds? How can we have less situations like we have in Indonesia and more situations like we have in Senegal, where actually there's a realization it's in everybody's interest at the country level to be working together and not ignoring each other. And in fact, a World Bank funded project or an IFAD funded project will be a whole lot stronger, a whole lot more resilient, a whole lot more sustainable if it's designed from the very beginning with the strong partnership of civil society organizations, especially farmer, indigenous peoples and women's organizations.
I think that's very important. Actually, the part is not somebody is bad or good, because we also should not prejudge anything, what is happening in many parts. But there are like what happened in Indonesia, and the organization fighting, and they continuously saying, how can we stay together, when the World Bank has recently approved and appreciated the Indonesian president's recent acts, which have actually resulted in a lot of protest by the civil society organization. So this crisis will often happen because many of the organizations, I know in the past when I've been part of many of these movements, so they start with World Bank and they end up with that. So, but we have to see the global realities also. We can't do away with this. It's not, World Bank is not coming to India because of the civil society. It's coming to India because of the Indian government. And also, like all governments say, they are representative of the people. So it's like who can negotiate on their own terms. And I think because last time when I was speaking to our former director, Majejo, he said it very well that we need investment in our country because there was no development, nothing happened. So people also need to get into, they need development. It's not merely, but what he was saying that we should have our own people and our own communities, and we should build up those people. So that if the World Bank and all those kind of organizations can really work with indigenous people and force the government or compel the governments, follow those ethic norms, at least the free, prior, informed consent, I think that would be the best thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the truth is, as the ILC, we need the World Bank and we need IFAD. We need these agencies that lend money to the governments to achieve what we want to achieve, because at the moment, the ILC members lead about 25 national platforms. These are national engagement strategies, which bring together a huge number, over 600 or 700 organizations are part of these platforms. So they extend far beyond the ILC membership. And many of these platforms have been working and have done an excellent job in developing very, very focused and long-term strategies for the change they want to see on land rights in their country. So they've got good strategies, they're inclusive, they're visionary, they're focused, they're strategic. But you then, the test is, how do these strategies get turned into reality? Because the strategies only make a difference when they are influencing the decisions of the government, the programming, the investment of the government. And one way to that is through those institutions that lend money to the government in the land sector. And so part of our success in our future will be our ability to persuade the World Bank that, for example, a land governance project should be done in this way and not that way. That a land governance project, if it takes into account the strategic priorities that have been developed through these multi-stakeholder platforms in a very inclusive way, that project will be a whole lot stronger and a whole lot more sustainable. And if we can make it work, it will really show the power of the strategies that members have been developing. If we can't make it work with the World Bank and IFAD in particular, our two members that have very large-scale lending programs in the land sector, then we run the risk that very good strategies end up remaining strategies on paper, and they don't actually feed into changing the reality of the countries that those strategies are developed in. So I see the risks, but I also think part of our responsibility, and for me in my role as director of IOC, part of my challenge is to lead us to a place where those kind of partnerships are possible, and they really make the difference for the strategies of multi-stakeholder platforms in IOC.
Yeah, I think one of the problem is that World Bank is just one of the constituents. There are others, and I'm sure that people appreciate other organizations, their contribution, particularly IFAD, which has built up this whole network. We supported the whole knowledge network, and then Popular Coalition, and then International Land Coalition, and we have very good work done by FAO, particularly in developing the VGGT. And there are some UN guidelines on indigenous people. So they are superb and very inclusive. Actually, those kind of inclusiveness we have not seen in our nation states. Actually, when we have here, the discussion is not that much inclusive, I can say. And I have used those guidelines many times in local circumstances, writing letters to our National Human Rights Commissions and pushing those things, that this is a part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it's become very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
All these,
yeah. Our members in the Philippines often talk about making a rice cake. That when you make a rice cake, you put pressure from below, and then you also put pressure on from above. So the two pressures work well, and I think that's very much part of our role as a global coalition. That organizations like yours are working at the local level, trying to change the way decisions are made, and we can add momentum to that by bringing sort of global norms and global ways of guidelines that can persuade governments from where they're sitting that it's a good idea, and that's our hope of bringing about change.
Yeah, that's one of the major campaign that ILC has been focusing on, like this land right campaign, and then land right campaign, land rights now. And land rights now has been focusing on the indigenous people and the issue. I want to ask, like, the two things, which is one is going on in Western part of the world is basically in the race question. And in our part of the world is the caste question. The race question, caste, because most of the non-UN based movement actually use these terminologies very much. Like they say Dalit movement, they will say, oh, Black Lives Matter. but the UN agencies and all the intergovernmental bodies, basically they don't use these terminologies. It's technical. But my question is, when we are talking about indigenous people, it's a very, very generalized term. Are we now, as a inclusive organization, will we say that, the race question, as like gender question, as and caste question become important for your policy formulation in the next, say, 10 years, 20 years?
I hope so. I hope so. I think, and this is again, one of the opportunities that we see out of a crisis, that with the terrible racial, the visibilization of racial inequality in the US, but not only in the US, there's been a huge growth in understanding of how unequal our world is. And the fact that your ethnicity or your race or your gender play a very big role in that. And that we're not all starting on an equal, we're not all working on and playing on an equal field. I think inequality is one of the words I hear very often when I hear members talk. I think it's a very big concern of the members of ILC, and therefore a very big task that we have as ILC to address. And you can't address inequality unless you call it by its name. You call it by what is making somebody unequal. Women's rights and gender justice have long been a very strong issue of ILC, and I think many members, it's probably the one issue that members have worked on together more than any other. Ethnicity and race, not so much, but they will have to be. They will have to be unless we address the roots of what causes inequality. How do we overcome it?
Yeah, that's a very very important. I hope that you will lead ILC into this direction also, because this is the issue which the organization which are particularly the governance, they avoid speaking the same term. Even in our governance structure in our country, we don't use the term. We have very technical terms. So people are frightened with the, if we say the Black Lives Matter or Dalit Lives Matter or Adivasis matters. So because they fear it, that identity politics will happen after this, and all those.
Yeah. But I think we can be encouraged by some of the wins of the indigenous peoples movement. If we compare back to 10, 15 years ago, when very few governments wanted to even use the word indigenous about people of their own population. Again, let me refer to my own country, Botswana. Botswana absolutely refused to recognize the distinct indigenous population before UNDRIP. But we can see the progress of indigenous peoples' struggles for recognition of their identity slowly becoming accepted. And it's still slow. And there are still many countries which do not build. We can be inspired by their successes, and we can build on those.
So you have a very, I would say, your experience, because you hail from Botswana, and a country in African region, beautiful country, and you must have come across, because this was a colonized country also. And what have been your experiences? How do you like your father's story I read, and I was really inspired by that work. So just wanted, it's a little bit of personal question, but I wanted to ask you about, how do you describe Botswana in terms of, because you come from a privileged community, and the people there, how is like this mix up? How was you able, did you ever feel alienated, or you feel no, it's part of?
Yeah, it's a good question. I could talk for the next 20 minutes answering it. I grew up in a very small village in Botswana, and my family was the only white family that was there. And we were there because my mom and my dad. So my dad originally came from South Africa, and my mom came as a volunteer teacher from England. Were working in what we now call the development sector, but it, at that time there wasn't really anything organized. Botswana got independence in 1966 as one of the poorest countries in the world, and so my mom and dad went and started up a small set of projects in a village, and their idea was, if we want to go and we want to be part of helping people find new opportunities, we need to live together with them. As part of the community. So they rented 2 small mud huts from the chief of the village, and that's where we lived. And so for me, it was normal growing up. We didn't have water, we didn't have electricity. I only appreciate now how hard that was for my mom. She cooked on a fire. We carried water from a tap, which was a few kilometers away. When I was big enough to help, I helped. And that's for me where I would say that's early experience is why I work on land issues now, because I came to realize that at the basis of society, of a cohesive society, is a relationship to the land, and when that's broken, society also risks starting to break down. But when that's strengthened, you're creating opportunities for the future. And so I grew up, I got a scholarship from my government to go and study anthropology at the University of Cape Town. And then I got another scholarship to go and do a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. So I come from a minority, a very small white minority in a government which fortunately never experienced colonialism. Botswana was not actually a colony, it was a protectorate. And it came about as a protectorate because back in the late 1800s, the Boers, who were the South Africans, were expanding their territory and wanted to incorporate Botswana into their territory, and Botswana couldn't resist. And so 3 chiefs went in 1885 to ask Queen Victoria for protection, which she did. She declared Botswana is now a British protectorate. And so the origin of relationships between white people and black people in Botswana had at the beginning a sense of partnership rather than a sense of exploitation, which is different from every country around Botswana. If you look at Namibia, which was colonized by the Germans, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, all had big white settler populations that went there for their own reasons, and Angola with the Portuguese. So Botswana remained this sort of small island of people of co-living together, quite a small white population, generally doing similar things to my parents. And so I've been very, very fortunate, and I only realize now how fortunate to grow up in a society where there was not a history of oppression, of exploitation, and therefore a division between races that so many countries in Africa have experienced because of how colonialism mistreated indigenous populations. And so, that's also shaped a little bit my approach to my work and my strong commitment to human rights and to justice. And again, coming back to land issues, building a more just society, for me, one of the roots of that is recognizing people's legitimate land rights.
Well, that's a very, very important point you raised, because we never knew about Botswana's history this way. Because I was curious to know about because last time I was speaking to a friend in South Africa, and our partner once upon a time. So she was narrating about her own experiences with racism, and I felt I wanted to speak you from this angle about how did you feel being a part of your country, Botswana, which is actually naturally very beautiful. So it's really, because when I read your father's work, and it was really inspiring, and I knew that how he made those things in the small village as you are narrating now. So it's definitely that has reflected in your perceptions, and that is the question I want to ask you further. about the human right defender, because you have been, your 30 years work is basically on human rights, and your research is on social anthropology. So you have seen all these relations. Now, these days, talking about land and human rights is a crime. In terms, in our governments feel it is a crime. So
Yep.
what can we do, particularly organizations like International Land Coalition and or intergovernmental organization here, when we see that raising human rights issues or raising the issues of land rights or resisting land grab becomes a crime, and it's a terrible crime. It becomes like, the government in powers have different methods. They may not even say that, they are taking action, or they are saying they can do many things which may not be visible. How do, as an international organization, you look at these issues, and how can we move ahead? How can we resolve these things? In a sense, is there any thing in your mind where we can have a platform or something to get these things resolved?
Yeah, it's a big question, Vivi. I think the first thing is just to say that we have to do what we can. We have to try. I think if I had to say one of the most important things that I think ILC strives to do is to build democracy. It's to try and build possibilities for inclusive and democratic decision making by people over their own lives, their own future, and their own land and natural resources. And at this time in history, where we see so many governments not respecting civic decision-making, civic space, and with quite deadly consequences in many countries. I led a delegation, a high-level delegation to our members in Guatemala in 2018. Because just in the first 5 months of that year, I think more than 12 people had been killed from our member organizations. Many more had been killed, maybe 20, but 12 from our member organizations had just been killed in a few months for their work in defending the land rights of their communities. And so when you get to such an extreme situation as that, what can you do but to just try and promote visibility? So we met with members of the government of Guatemala, and our message was, the world is watching. What's happening in your country is something the world is aware about and cares about, and you're not doing this in cover of darkness. You're doing this in the light, and it's been seen. And sometimes even just something as simple as that. It's all that we can do, but it's a message to the government, and it's a gesture of solidarity to the very, very brave women and men who are continuing to try and stand for their rights in such dangerous, terribly dangerous situations. So that's part of what we can do as a network. Part of it is linking up and working together and supporting and training our members who work in such difficult situations. How to keep your communication secure so that you can't be listened into. For example, in some countries that can make the difference between life and death. We have an emergency fund which supports human rights defenders, land and environmental defenders that need to be taken to safety very quickly because their lives are in danger. We support members to write shadow reports that go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva with ECOSOC and with the SDGs as well. So there are many things which, on the face of it may seem little and small, but I think together amount to something significant. But the real change that we're trying to bring is shifting the norms to say, it's not acceptable to have these kind of practices. That's a big task, though, because we think we're seeing progress, huh? And then a populist government comes in, and we see the kind of populist governments our members in Brazil are dealing with,
Yeah.
that our members in India are dealing with. And, in Indonesia, we see a people's president that came in. When I met Widodo in 2018,
Yes.
he was speaking about empowering, giving the land back to peasants.
Yeah,
And now
that
we
was
see him trying to pass an omnibus law, which aids corporate takeover of land. So it will always be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, but we do what we can to keep that space open.
So where do you think ILC 10 years from now? What is your vision about ILC? How do you want to take it further?
Well, it's a good question to ask now, because in fact we're working on the strategy. So we've been consulting members, and on Monday we have a council meeting to get the next round of inputs on the strategy, which will be to 2030. So the next strategy for ILC will be aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals, and so that's what I would say, that the ILC of 2030 is a powerful platform of people's organizations. So at the center of the ILC of 10 years from now must be people's organizations and other organizations in solidarity and support, but the voice of ILC must be the voice of women and men farmers, the voice of pastoralists, the voice of indigenous peoples, Dalits, of fisherfolk. That is a powerful voice enough that we've made progress towards the land rights targets in the SDGs, and land is acknowledged as being at the center of building the kind of world that we want to build, which is more equal, more just, and more inclusive.
Okay, I think thank you very much, Mike, for speaking so clearly and very candidly about what is the future and how important is land rights for our generation, for the indigenous people, for the importance of world peace and democracy. So thank you very much, and hope to speak to you again some point of time.
Absolutely. Vibi, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for doing this brilliant series, and I feel very honored to have been a part of it with you. Thank you.